What's up, guys? Chris Irvin, the Ketologist, coming at you from Austin, Texas. Today I'm doing my first Q&A episode on this YouTube channel. So basically what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be posting an opportunity to submit a question on Instagram every single week. And then I'm going to be choosing around 10 to 15 of those questions and recording a Q&A video and then posting it on YouTube. So this is my first time doing that. I posted the questions yesterday. I received some really good ones and I'm going to run through those now. I have them written down. We're going to go over 12 of them today. A lot of questions about exercise, some questions on supplementation, a couple questions on calories and things like that. So we're just going to go ahead and dive into it. So the first question, I'm going to kind of organize these a little bit different than how they came in, but the first question that I had that I thought was really interesting was, what does keto look like for an endurance athlete? And the reason why this is a really important question is because previously it was always thought that endurance athletes had to have carbohydrates to perform well. It was just kind of this thing where you had to, a lot of you guys are probably familiar with carb loading. You have to consume carbohydrates before your endurance exercise because that gives you the fuel that you need to perform. And this was kind of conventional wisdom for a long time. And then a lot of big names in the game kind of came around and found that this wasn't true. People like Dr. Jeff Volek, Dr. Stephen Phinney, Professor Tim Noakes, guys like that who kind of found that, endurance athletes can actually perform not just okay on a ketogenic diet, but they actually perform better on a ketogenic diet. And the reason why that is because when you're constantly loading your body with carbohydrates, and if you're a carb-adapted athlete, all you really have to use for energy is the carbs that you eat and the little bit of carbs that your body can store as glycogen. And once you burn through that, it's a little bit harder for carb-adapted athletes to tap into their body fat stores. So that means that these carb-adapted athletes don't have as much energy to use during endurance exercise. Now, when you're in a state of ketosis or you're following a ketogenic diet, you remember your insulin levels are staying very low, which means that you're able to tap into stored body fat very easily. Now, the difference here is that your body can only store about 2,000 calories from carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, but even in the leanest of athletes, you can store over 20,000 calories from fat. So that means that you just have a lot more energy that you can tap into. Another big thing is that when you're in a state of ketosis, you have ketones floating in your body, and these ketones can be used by the brain. One of the things that we know about like ultra endurance athletes is that they're very prone to like a bonk, which basically kind of happens when your central nervous system shuts down from prolonged exercise because you don't have enough energy going to your brain. But when you're in a state of ketosis, you don't have to worry about that because you're constantly producing these ketones while you're exercising. So what does it look like to be an endurance athlete and follow keto? It typically looks like better performance, and it also looks like improved body composition when you're doing that. So you're burning fat, which is great, but you're also providing your body with the fuel it needs to perform at a very high level. So if you want to look into it, there's a lot of research from, like the guys I mentioned earlier, Dr. Volek and Stephen Phinney, who have found that ketogenic athletes can perform at a very high level during endurance exercise. So I would suggest looking into them. And there's also a great resource out there called The Art of Low Carb Performance, which is by them as well. So I would check that out. So that kind of leads into another question that somebody asked that says, are exogenous ketones beneficial for endurance exercise? And this is something that hasn't been researched as much, but I would say that they are. And that's because what exogenous ketones are going to do is that they're going to provide you with a little bit of a bump in your ketone levels for about 2 to 3 hours after taking them. So that means that you just have more of these ketones available. And this can be really beneficial during endurance exercise or really any type of exercise because you're providing fuel to the brain, which can allow you to perform at a higher level and carry on this endurance exercise for a longer period of time. So I would say they're not essential for it, but they can be beneficial. At KetoCon, I gave a presentation talking about like body composition and sports performance and things like that on keto, and I actually had somebody come to the front and say that they were doing really long duration bicycle rides and they found exogenous ketones to be very beneficial. And this is kind of a common trend. We hear a lot of keto athletes saying that exogenous ketones are very beneficial during this time. So I would say yes, those things are great for that. Staying on the topic of sports performance in general, exercise, things like that, one of the questions that I got was, doing HIIT which is high intensity interval training, what to eat before and after sessions. And I think this is a great question because a lot of people don't really know, what am I supposed to eat before and after I work out? For those of you who don't know, HIIT is high intensity interval training. That just means you're performing exercise at a very high intensity for a short period of time, and then that's followed up by a recovery period, and then you usually hit it again. It's really great for fat burning, really great for a lot of different exercise-induced adaptations in the body. So the answer to that question is it depends on your goal. So if your goal is to, maximize fat burning during your exercise, I would say that consuming foods that are going to keep your insulin very low, so foods that are higher in fat, and staying away from carbohydrates prior to the training is going to allow you to burn more fat during that session because you're not stimulating insulin. So I'd say that that's probably more beneficial if your main goal is fat burning. But if your main goal is performance for that high intensity interval training, then you might be a little bit different. Some people may benefit from having a little bit of carbohydrates before they exercise. Now, does that mean that you need carbohydrates to perform at a high level? No, it does not. But carbohydrates can be a little bit of an ergogenic aid, or they can enhance your exercise because of some of the reward centers that get activated when we have them. We feel a little bit better right after having carbohydrates, and this tends to kind of give us a little boost in our exercise performance. So if your main goal is performance, you may find that that carbohydrates are better to consume before your exercise. But you may be like me and find that carbohydrates actually make you more groggy before you exercise, and it's better for you to stay away from them. So the real answer to that question is besides goal, I think the best thing is whatever you can put in your body that's going to allow you to train at the highest intensity. So a lot of studies that have compared training in a fasted versus a fed state haven't really found significant differences. So I think whatever allows you to train at the highest intensity is going to be what's most beneficial to consume before your exercise. For some people, that may be a protein shake. For some people, that may be a fatty coffee. For some people, that may be fasting. It really just depends who you are and what your goal is. Now, the second part to that question was, what about after exercise? And after exercise, I think it's very important to consider recovery. That this is our recovery period. It's a chance to kind of refuel our body. I think during this period of time, having protein is very beneficial, and depending on your training status, having a fast absorbing protein like a whey protein isolate can be a really good idea. Getting a lot of nutrients in your body. So maybe you want to make like a fatty shake where you can put some like avocado in there, you can put some salt in there, you can put some other like micronutrients in there to help yourself recover a little bit. And then I think electrolytes are a big thing to take after. So we really want to be focusing on recovery during that post-exercise window. Another question that I think kind of falls in line with this is that somebody asked, I weight train, but I'm still trying to lose fat. What is the best way to do this? And kind of the second part to this question is I've heard that you can only lose fat or gain muscle, that you can't do both at the same time. And, traditionally it was thought that you couldn't do both. A lot of, before we really started looking into ketogenic dieting, it seemed very hard for people to, burn fat, but also create muscle at the same time. But interestingly enough, there's been a lot of studies showing that you can do that on a ketogenic diet. So, and the reason why this is, there's a lot of reasons why this happens, but one of them is kind of changes that happen in our mitochondria when we're burning ketones. So things like activating brown adipose tissue is a big one. Things like our mitochondrial uncoupling proteins is a big one. A lot of really good research coming from people like Dr. Ben Bickman have shown that myocytes or muscle cells can actually have a pretty great ability to grow when they're using ketones for energy. And in fact, ketones can even stimulate muscle protein synthesis to a degree. So the truth is that you can do both on a ketogenic diet, and it has been well supported in research. So the best possible way to do this is simply by following a ketogenic diet and incorporating exercise. So you want to make sure that you are creating a stimulus that is going to allow for muscle gain. So that means, incorporating resistance training to a level of intensity that's going to stimulate those gains. So that's a big one. And then the other big thing is that you want to make sure that you're getting adequate protein. So a lot of people who follow keto, they fear protein. They fear that they're going to have too much. It's going to kick them out of ketosis. That's not how things work. That's kind of a topic for a different video, but that's not something that you really need to worry about. In fact, a study that came out last year found that when people were exercising and following a ketogenic diet and only eating 20% of their calories from protein, they actually lost muscle doing that. But when we start looking at studies that are using a little bit higher protein intake, they're showing that you can gain muscle. So it's really important that, just as important as stimulating through stimulating muscle growth through the exercise, you also want to stimulate it during the recovery period so getting protein in the post-workout window and getting enough protein over the course of the day is really important for that. And then, a couple more questions about exercise. Another one was creatine on keto. Is that beneficial? Yes, it actually is. So I think that creatine is a great amino acid. We can get it naturally from eating meat, and I think that that's probably the best source that we can get it from. But if you're exercising, there's a lot of benefits to taking creatine. The creatine has been shown to stimulate some muscle growth. It's been shown to improve our exercise performance. And also outside of that, there's some health benefits to taking creatine, like our cognitive function or our brain health can actually benefit from taking creatine. So it is beneficial. You get a lot of people that fear that creatine is going to cause them to bloat and cause excess weight gain and stuff. That's just not really how it works. But creatine is beneficial on a ketogenic diet, and I think it's great if you're exercising. So from there, we have a couple more questions about supplementation. So one of the questions I thought was really interesting was, how long after taking BHB or exogenous ketones can you test ketones and know your results won't be skewed? I think that's a great question. So for those of you who aren't really familiar, exogenous ketones are supplemental ketones. When we take them, they will increase our blood ketones for a certain period of time. And that period of time, if you test your blood ketones, they're going to be higher. So obviously it's going to be a little bit skewed and it's not going to be a true reading. So if you're trying to get a true reading about what your body's producing naturally, obviously you want to wait till those are out of your system. So it is a little bit different for everybody. So I would suggest that you test your ketones, test your response to exogenous ketones or BHB and see how your body is responding and see how long it takes you to kind of get back to your baseline level. Typically what I found for me personally, and when I was in grad school doing a lot of research with exogenous ketones, is I found that for most people after 2 to 3 hours, after taking the exogenous ketones, you're back down to a baseline level. So I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. It seems to be what happens in most people. But like I said, testing is really important to see what's happening for you when you take it. Another question that we got was, are Perfect Keto shakes a meal replacement? So I think that this is probably referring to either our Perfect Keto Whey or our Perfect Keto Collagen. And regardless, the answer is that they can be, but it's not something that you should rely on. So the whey and the collagen are great sources of protein, great sources of amino acids that can be very beneficial for increasing your protein intake on a ketogenic diet, which I kind of just alluded to can be really beneficial for certain people. But for things like whey protein isolate, there's not a whole lot of other nutrients in there because whey protein isolate has gone through this process of this filtration process that takes out a lot of the lactose and the casein and the things we're trying to avoid while we're on a ketogenic diet. But it also kind of strips it of a lot of nutrients. So the problem with using these shakes as a meal replacement all of the time is that you could be missing out on a lot of micronutrients. So we have to remember that there's a lot more to our foods than just macronutrients. Micronutrients are also important, and the best sources of micronutrients are from whole foods. So in a pinch, shakes can be a fantastic meal replacement, something that's great if you're on the go or you don't have enough time. It's a convenience thing, fantastic use for them. But not something that we should be depending on all of the time. I think it's really important for us to be getting a lot of whole foods in our diet, especially during meals, for that that case of getting enough micronutrients in. A couple more questions to go through here. One big one that I think is really interesting is how to deal with muscle fatigue on keto. This is something that's very common, and the most common answer that I can give you, and I think this is the case for most people, is hydrating, getting enough water in, and replenishing electrolytes, especially sodium. But also potassium and magnesium can also play a big role there. But if you're getting a lot of muscle cramps, it's most likely because you're dehydrated and electrolyte deficient. That's because when you're following a ketogenic diet, you stop eating carbs, your blood glucose lowers, that makes your insulin levels go low, which makes your kidneys excrete more water and electrolytes, making you prone to dehydration. Not a bad thing, but what it means is that we have to focus on replenishing those things. And sodium is a big one there. So especially if you're exercising and you have a high sweat rate, you want to make sure you're replenishing that. So focus on getting that water in, salt your foods, use electrolyte supplementation, and look for whole food sources of electrolytes too, like mixed nuts can be a great source, avocados, things like that. That's gonna be a great way to avoid muscle cramps. Another question I got is how to break through a weight loss stall. Less calories? I don't cheat at all. That was the question. So they're saying, is less calories the option here? I don't cheat at all. What's going on? So less calories is not necessarily the answer. Now, here's kind of the thing there. I'm not gonna go deep into a calorie rant here, but calories are not the most important thing for weight loss, despite what a lot of people will tell you. Calories matter, yes, but they matter less on a ketogenic diet. Doesn't mean they don't matter at all, but they matter less. So here's the thing. Track your calories if you're stuck at a weight loss plateau. If you're consuming 4,000 calories in a day, yeah, it might be a calorie thing. You need to cut it back. But what I would venture to say the problem here is that you probably are having some food sensitivities that are causing you to hit a weight loss plateau. Dairy is a very common one on a ketogenic diet. People go a little bit overboard with cheese, especially like processed cheese. And those things can cause you to have weight loss stalls. So I would try cutting out like dairy, seeing what that does for you. I would also try incorporating exercise. That can be a big one. If you're not exercising currently, that can be just a great way to stimulate more fat loss. And I would also pay attention to your net carb intake. I think that your total carb intake. I think a lot of times when people are tracking net carbs, that leads their total carb intake to go a little bit high, which is something I call the carb creep, where people think they're consuming 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates, but really when we break it down, next thing we know, they're eating 50, 60 grams of carbohydrates. And the reason why this is important is because if you are stimulating insulin production, insulin directly inhibits fat loss. So if your carbs are creeping up a little bit too high, it's very possible that you're kind of taking your body out of that optimal fat burning state that you're trying to induce on a ketogenic diet. So check into that and kind of see. So the kind of the main point there is that I wouldn't advise you to just all of a sudden assume that calories are the problem. Like I said, track them. If you're in the 4,000 range, then that could be an issue. But I think that there's some other things that you can look at, like food sensitivities with dairy, your total carb intake, and incorporating exercise. I also have a program on my website that's a keto weight loss plateau buster. It's something that I put together. It's like a step-by-step program for figuring out like what's wrong with what's going on with your diet and how you can kind of fix it. And it just kind of goes through each option one by one to see what you can do to get back on track. So you can also check that out. All right, let me go through and see what other questions I have here. Another one on supplements that I missed. It says best usage of protein powder on keto dieting, and is it worth implementing? And we talked about that a little bit. I probably should have included that earlier when I was talking about protein powders. But the best usage of a protein powder is one during the recovery window, like I mentioned. So whey protein is a very fast absorbing protein, which means that your body can take it. It stimulates muscle protein synthesis very quickly, which is the rebuilding of muscle. And this is great in the post-workout window. Not as important for people who are new to exercising, but one of the things that we know is that people who are more adapted to resistance training, they can benefit more from that nutrient timing. It becomes a little bit more important in that post-workout window. So consuming protein during that window can be a really great use for it. Now, outside of that, just protein powders in general can be a great way to make sure that you're getting enough protein over the course of your whole day. So for, like I mentioned before, some of these studies where people are eating very low amounts of protein, like 20% of their calories or less on a ketogenic diet, show a little bit of muscle loss sometimes, especially if they're working out. So that's a case for getting enough protein in the day. But for some people, we're full, or it's just hard for us to get that extra meal with protein in. But these protein shakes can be a great way to conveniently get protein in just through a little beverage where you can get between 20 to 30 grams of protein in. So that's, I think, one of the best implementations of it. I do think it's worth implementing because I think a lot of people are under consuming protein. I think it's something that we can do a better job of. And I think that's a great reason for using protein shakes. All right, let's see. Last question I believe I have is, how many servings of vegetables in a day is the question. And I think this is a good question because it's kind of something that we're confused about. I think that there's probably a little bit to unpack here. The first thing is that if you're asking this because you're worried that vegetables are going to kick you out of ketosis, don't worry about that. If you're sticking to leafy green vegetables, that's the least of your worries. You're doing a fantastic job. So I wouldn't stress about having 3 servings of vegetables versus having 5 servings of vegetables. I think you're going to be just fine, unless you're experiencing some gastrointestinal distress. So if you guys follow me on Instagram, I put up a post last week showing people who were constipated and were having a lot of problems with bowel movements. When they actually lowered their fiber intake, they saw that they increased the frequency of their bowel movements and they got rid of their constipation. And that's because fiber isn't as important as what we once thought it was. So if you're experiencing problems from vegetables, like a lot of bloating, constipation, things like that, that's probably a good case for you to lower your intake. But if this question is coming from you're assuming that you need to have enough vegetables to get like your micronutrients in, I would actually challenge that and say that it's not as important. So I wouldn't think about it that way. one of the things we know is that humans are only able to absorb a very small percentage of the micronutrients that are found in plants. We actually absorb micronutrients that come from animal sources a lot better because like ruminant animals like cows are actually able to consume the plants and convert those nutrients in the plants into a more bioavailable or better absorbed source for us to use as humans. So if you're thinking that like, oh man, I've heard that on a ketogenic diet it's really important for me to get enough fiber in and get a lot of micronutrients from vegetables, how much should I eat? The answer is that you really don't have to eat any. That's why the carnivore diet is so beneficial, or not so beneficial, it is beneficial, but that's the reason why the carnivore diet has been showing a lot of benefits, because you don't have to have vegetables in your diet. You can actually thrive just fine without them. They're not essential. That doesn't mean that you have to avoid them or that they're bad for you necessarily, but you can do just fine without them. So I would say that you don't need to focus on that. So that is all of the questions for this week, guys. If you submitted a question and I didn't get to it, it's just because I didn't think that it kind of aligned with this video and some of the things that we were talking about, but I will get to your answer anyway. If you guys are following this, coming to this YouTube video from somewhere else other than Instagram, I would suggest going and following me on Instagram so you can submit your questions every week and I can answer these. If you find the information in this video valuable, please share it with a friend. The whole goal about these things is trying to get some of these very commonly asked keto questions answered for people. So if you know people who are looking for answers that are answered in this video, please share it with them. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and be on the lookout for another Q&A episode coming soon.